Atheist Alliance International podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Atheist Alliance International podcast. I'm your host, Jason Sylvester. Joining me today is Dr. John Andrew Morrow, who's written a book on the Hijab. So I don't know anything about Hijab. I mean, I know a little bit about, very little, so I'm not an expert on this topic, but Dr. Morrow has done a lot of research, so we'll turn it over to him. So, Dr. Morrow, thank you for joining us. So maybe just give our viewers a little bit of a background introduction on yourself, and then we can dive into your book.
Sure. I'm John Andrew Morrow. I'm a professor, a scholar, an author, an academic. I've published many works on different topics. One of my most recent works is this book titled Hijab, Word of God or Word of Man, which was published in 2024 by Academica Press, which is based in Washington, D.C. and also in London. So this work is a study. It examines the history of veiling. All right, so veiling is not a practice that is exclusive to Islam. It predates Islam. It's found in Christianity, it's found in Judaism, it's also found in paganism. So there are many works on the hijab out there. They're primarily written by Muslim men. And those works are written from a religious point of view and generally try to convince women that it is an obligation and a divine duty for them to wear hijab or to wear the veil. So this work is actually objective, impartial. It is an academic work from a historical point of view. So it doesn't rely exclusively on religious texts. So those works I was referencing, they will draw from the Quran. They will also draw from the Hadith literature, Islamic jurisprudence, and so on. Now, I do all of that. I give the traditional Islamic point of view or the dominant point of view in the work, but I also examine, the origins of these beliefs and these practices. And most importantly, I focus on variant opinions, minority opinions. And so in those works on hijab, written by Muslim men and occasionally by Muslim women, the focus is on the dominant position, which is that women must cover everything except their faces and hands. And there are some scholars who say that they can show their feet, or they'll focus on the position that they have to cover everything, including their faces, with the exception of two eyes or maybe one eye, and that they have to cover their hands and that they have to cover their feet. And so if you would ask most Muslims and most Muslim women about hijab, that would be their interpretation, that you have to cover everything except your face and your hands. Some would say, your feet as well. Or some who are stricter say they have to cover everything, even their faces, so they would wear a burqa or a niqab. The overwhelming majority of Muslims are not familiar with the other rulings and edicts that have been issued over the past 1400 years by Muslim scholars, and these are positions that are far more moderate and lenient, and in some cases quite liberal. So that just gives you an overview of the book. Yes. And so my goal, one of my goals, is to give women options and present all of these positions to them so that they're well informed.
Okay. So you mentioned that veiling then is common. It's not just an Islamic thing. So obviously, with nuns in the Western Christian tradition, we have veiling of that. So, and so regular watchers may remember I've lived in Pakistan. I worked there about 6 years ago. One of the things I noticed in Pakistan was the level of veiling. Some women didn't wear it at all. Some women just wore the headscarf, and some were like the head to toe in the burqa. So it seems to be much more both on a family level, the level of veiling that is imposed. It's also between different, like in different countries, the culture is different. Are you finding that as well in your research, that there is a difference between families and between societies?
Yes, absolutely. Time and place. These are the considerations. Now, the veil, when we mentioned the hijab now in 2024, the image that comes to mind is, this tight hijab. It could be dark, it could be black. Um, that type of hijab is actually a recent innovation. So it's actually it's not the traditional hijab or the traditional veil. This is the hijab or the veil of political Islam, of the Islamists, and it has increased exponentially since the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. And it has spread, throughout Saudi Arabia under the Wahhabis there, and it was disseminated throughout the world by the Islamists in Iran and the Taliban in Afghanistan. But if you study the history of clothing, costume, and attire, you will find that this is not how Muslim women have dressed historically over the past 1400 years. Um, so, that's one of the contributions of this book is that I actually go back and I trace the history of clothing in the Muslim world. Yes, to correct that impression that many Muslims have that this is the way that Muslim women dressed and that they have always dressed. That is not the case. That's not how Muslim women dressed overwhelmingly in the 1970s, the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, and so on. There was a time when the majority of Muslim women did not dress that way and they did not veil. And so it's important to view things from a broader historical perspective and not just an ideological one.
And so you're saying that it's mostly since the Iranian Revolution of 79 that this has really sort of picked up and proliferated throughout multiple Muslim cultures around the world, not just the Iranians.
Yes, absolutely, and that is the case if we study the history of clothing. Certainly.
Right. And so prior to 79, then most Muslim women in the majority of cultures were not veiling, they were just dressing like the average Western woman would
Well, they were not
today.
veiling that way. It
Okay.
wasn't that type of strict veiling, and so there are some Muslims who talk about the hijab or the veiling of ethnicity or ethnic attire, which according to them did not live up to Sharia standards. And so they try to make that distinction between the hijab of Islamicity and the hijab of ethnicity. But to say that, to claim that Muslim women have not been, respecting the Quran and Islam and so on for 1400 years is quite a claim to make, right? Because there are consequences to that. Yes.
And so was it mostly the Iranian Revolution that proliferated this, or this was more of a widespread, like students of history would know that, like, we see sort of this um proliferation of Islamism, like in the 70s and 80s, like in like the what would be the proper term? Sort of an increase in restrictions on women, an increase on terrorist activities, much more of a radical version of Islam that
Oh,
had
absolutely.
really preceded it.
It's all interconnected. Sure. So there were two factors, two main players: the political Shiites, the pro-Iranian Islamists, and on the other side, the Salafi Wahhabis out of Saudi Arabia. And they spent billions upon billions of dollars disseminating that radical interpretation of the Islamic religion. So it was happening in the Shiite camp and also in the Sunni camp. All right, and so there's a clear correspondence between the spread of that ideology and the proliferation of this new type of Islamist hijab. Take the case of Turkey, for example. 20 years ago, the vast majority of Turkish women did not veil themselves. But then Erdogan and his Islamist party took power. And now, they've proliferated like, mushrooms and so on. The same thing, if you look at Algeria, most Algerian women do not wear hijab. Then the Groupe Armé Islamique and all of these other Islamists started their terrorist activities and so on. They started, they started actually committing all kinds of crimes and atrocities against women who weren't wearing the veil. And then overnight, the majority of Algerian women, started to wear black veils out of fear. And so that accounts for the spread of the hijab in places like Algeria. It was spread through terror. In Saudi Arabia, through the force of law. In Iran, through the force of law. And it continues to this day, which explains all of these hijab protests. Yes, in Iran, if you do not veil according to a certain interpretation, you are subject to fines, you are subject to imprisonment. So you can spend several years in prison. There were some anti-hijab activists, and by anti-hijab I don't mean that they're against hijab. They are against mandatory enforced hijab. So that is their position. Their position is that if a woman wants to cover her hair, then let her do it. But you cannot force other women to do so. And simply for taking that position, these women have been sentenced to 50 years in prison. 50 years in prison simply for saying that women should have the right to choose. On top of that, these women have been imprisoned. Some of them have been assaulted physically and sexually, and some of them have been killed. Women have had their skulls cracked open and have died for opposing mandatory hijab.
Right, right. And we've seen the protests over the last year or so from Iran over
And they have
Masai.
cracked down brutally on these women and these men.
Right.
Brutally.
So I've heard from friends who've grown up in the Muslim countries that the veiling is it's really much more of a cultural and a family thing, that it depends on the culture you come from, whether it's a really strict Islamic culture like you mentioned, like Algeria, Iran prior to the revolutions were much more open and free, but some of the cultures like in Afghanistan, like prior to the Taliban, maybe have been a little bit more conservative. So is that your findings as well, that the more conservative cultures tend to enforce the veiling over other more liberal Muslim cultures?
Well, it's not just the cultures. It's actually, their interpretation of Islam. It depends on who's in power. In Afghanistan, for example, I mean, this clothing that the Taliban imposed, their dress code, which is, decreed by law, historians, experts in the history of fashion, and so on, declared quite clearly that no woman in the history of Afghanistan has ever dressed that way. So that type of attire has nothing to do with traditional Afghan clothing, which was quite elegant, quite beautiful. Afghan women didn't cover their hair like that. They didn't wear burqas and face veils and so on. And so I would encourage viewers to look up, the historical attire from those places. And many people have posted these photographs from before the Taliban and before Khomeini, and pictures from Lebanon, pictures from Iraq, pictures from Morocco. Look and see how your mothers, or especially your grandmothers, used to dress, and you will find that the contrast is stark. That this is not the traditional attire from these countries and these cultures, and that type of clothing is associated with political Islamism.
Are there examples from history of cultures that have enforced veiling in the past, or this is mostly a 20th century Islamist development?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. It's one thing for a jurist, in a mosque, sitting in a circle with other scholars to come up with all of these rules. It's another thing to actually impose them on a population. And so you need a court system, you need law enforcement. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, they have this religious police. And they have, the same thing in Iran. In other countries, it's enforced through vigilantes and harassment and so on. But, you need someone there to enforce it. And that is something that would have been very, very difficult for any government to do in the past. So you didn't find this among, among the Abbasids or the Umayyads or the Moguls or other Islamic empires in the past. You don't find actual enforcement for hijab. You don't find any corporal punishment and things of that nature. So that is very much a 20th century innovation in Islamic jurisprudence.
Yeah, you mentioned the Saudi religious police, but they were disbanded a few years ago, were they not?
Yes, they've got new leadership. They have a new vision. They've recanted. I don't know how much they've repented, but the policies are changing there. And I've read, the vision that that the current administration has. They've published all kinds of documents regarding their positions. They claim to be against religious extremism and the Wahhabism that was imposed in the past. So they are making progress. They're liberalizing, their culture and society. Because the fact of the matter is, Saudi women didn't dress that way before, the rise of political Islam. And so there are books, many, many books, and I relied upon them. Histories of costume. Yes, and so you see how Chechen women used to dress, how Bosnian women used to dress, how women used to dress in Morocco and other parts of the world. Yes, this Islamist uniformity didn't exist. The attire, some of it was conservative, but it was also elegant and classy and beautiful and colorful. It was flexible. So all of that is covered in this book. Now, I mean, the other question is, the subtitle of the book is obviously, hijab, word of God or word of man. This is very important because many Muslims believe that this is actually the word of God. And for it to be the word of God, it has to be based on the Quran, okay? According to, Islamic beliefs and so on. But if we examine the Quran, critically, and we look at these verses, if you ask the average Muslim woman, why do you wear hijab? She'll say, well, because it's part of my religion. Well, where do you get this from? Well, is it in the Quran? Yes. Well, show me where it is in the Quran. And you'll find that 99% of them cannot point to any verse in the Quran that says that women have to cover that way. They'll say, well, I know it's there, I just don't know where it's there. Or they'll tell you, ask a scholar. They simply don't know. But if we look at the Quran, we find that there is a verse that instructs women that they have to cover their furuj, okay? Their furuj, which simply means their genitals, their private parts. So it says, guard their furuj, all right? And now the interpreters, they took that term furuj, which just means genitals and private parts, and expanded it through a process of semantic stretching, right? And so they expanded it to the point that it covers the entirety of the female form. There are some other verses in the Quran that say that, human beings should cover their sawa. And this word, once again, simply means genitals. It means private parts. There's another verse that says that women have to cover their zina. Now, zina means beauty. Cover their beauty. That's what they're supposed to do. And according to these most extreme of interpreters, well, that applies to the entirety of the female form. But that verse also says that they should cover their beauty except ma zahara minha, except what normally appears. All right? So clearly, there are parts of women that can be shown, those parts that normally appear. And so, again, they take this term zina or beauty and they expand it to women as a whole. There's another verse in the Quran that says that women should wear a khimar. And they interpret that as a veil. But this word in Arabic simply means a covering. And so the verse says that women should cast their khimar, or their covering, over their juyub. Now, juyub is very clear in Arabic. It means bosom, it means breasts, it means cleavage. So basically it's saying cover your bosoms or your breasts. There's another verse that says that women, when they go outside, to avoid being harassed, should wear a jilbab. And again, a jilbab is just an outer garment. It is not something that envelops a woman completely. So if we rely simply on the Quran, and we're not influenced by the Hadith literature, which appeared hundreds of years, which was only recorded by and large 300 years, sometimes 500 years, sometimes 1,000 years after the Prophet. If we rely on the Quran and we're not influenced by these secondary sources, there is no basis for the claim that women have to cover themselves from head to toe. Absolutely. There is no Quranic foundation or basis for that belief.
Okay, what about in the Hadith? Are there passages in the Hadith that mention veiling?
There are a few, there aren't many, and they are disputed. It is the consensus of historical, critical scholars who consist of non-Muslims and also Muslims. There are historical, critical scholars who are believing Muslims. The consensus is that the Hadith literature is not reliable. And that has been clearly demonstrated. This literature surfaced hundreds of years after the Prophet Muhammad. And I mean, there are red flags. A hadith starts with so and so said, that 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 he heard that so and so said from his grandfather that he overheard the Prophet say such and such a thing. So, generally speaking, there are at least 6 narrators or transmitters in any given hadith. And so, by and large, this is oral literature. It was transmitted orally for generations, or simply these chains of narration were invented in order to try to connect it back to the Prophet. But we see that much of this literature is ideologically motivated, or motivated due to sectarian interests and so on. And so, yes, from the point of view of the Hadith, one could come to a conclusion that women should wear the veil. However, not according to the Quran. And so the question to Muslims is, when you derive rulings, what is your primary source? Are you relying on the Quran and interpreting everything else in light of the Quran? Or are you relying on the Hadith? And we find that overwhelmingly among Muslim scholars that they placed the Hadith over and above the Quran. And when they interpreted the Quran, it was colored by the Hadith literature. But if we look at the Quran itself and we try to determine what was the meaning of this text in its original form, what was the original meaning? How was this understood in the 7th century at the time of the Prophet? We cannot come to the conclusion that hijab is obligatory.
And were there examples in certain cultures? So I mean, obviously in Judaism and Christianity, we have this pattern of men and women, but mostly women, covering their heads when they're going into a temple or a church. Are there some cultures that required women to veil when going into a mosque? Is that the origin of this, or this is all cultural? Like, this is coming from the various different cultures that became Islamic over the centuries?
All right, so this is a very good question. All right, the origin of veiling. All right, so there was a Christian influence on Islam, and so Islam spreads out of Arabia. It establishes its foundations in what used to be Byzantium. And so you have the impact of Christianity and existing customs there. It spreads into Persia, and so we have to look at, the pre-Islamic customs and traditions and beliefs found in Persia. And so that's like immediate influence there. By and large, historians believe that the veil, the Islamic veil as we understand it, was adopted by Muslims as they spread into the Middle East, into the Levant, and into Persia, where these customs already existed. They tended to be customs that were practiced by the upper class, who tended to veil their women and seclude them. This is not something that was imposed upon ordinary women, working class women, and so on. This was something reserved to the elite. And so the Muslims, when they became the elite, they adopted these customs. But the question is, where did these customs come from? All right. And in terms of veiling, okay, one of the influences, like there is this one verse that is used, which is 24 24:31 from the Quran. Um, yeah, it says, "And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their coverings over their bosoms, and not display their beauty except to their husbands, and that they should not strike their feet in order to draw attention to their hidden ornaments." Okay, so this actually derives from a work known as the Didascalia Apostolorum, which is the teachings of the apostles. All right, and this is a 3rd century work written in Syriac. It is a Judeo-Christian work. And in this work, we find the following saying: "If thou wishes to be faithful, please thy husband only, and when thou walkest in the marketplace, cover thy head with thy garment, that by thy veil the greatness of thy beauty be covered. Do not adorn the face of thine eyes, but look down and walk veiled," and so on. So, the verse in the Quran that is used to mandate veiling actually draws from a Judeo-Christian apocryphal work. And so there's a clear connection there. So this is a case of intertextuality. Yes. But the veiling itself ultimately goes back thousands of years. It goes back at least 2,000 years before the Common Era, and is associated with the cult of Ishtar, who was a goddess of fertility. And her, the faithful used to practice what is known as hierogamos, or sacred marriage, which is also known as sacred prostitution. All right? And so the first women to veil themselves in history were the priestesses, these women who engaged in rites of sacred prostitution in Mesopotamia. And so the goddess herself is featured with a veil. She covers her hair. And her followers, to signal that they were followers of Ishtar, they used to cover their hair as well, wearing veils. So it is, in the Code of Hammurabi, right, that we find a reference to these temple prostitutes and so on, and it's actually from the year 1200 before the Common Era that we find the first law mandating the covering of the hair. The law states that a wife of a man or widows or Assyrian women who will go out in the main thoroughfare shall not have their heads bare. Daughters of a man with either a cloth or garments shall be veiled when they go about in the main thoroughfare, and so on. So yes. And we find that, according to the Assyrian law code, a prostitute shall not veil herself, her head shall be bare. And so, the practice of veiling in Mesopotamia, which is now modern-day Iraq, goes back several thousands of years before the Common Era. It was mandated that married women cover their hair. It was prohibited for single women to cover their hair. And you can distinguish between a married woman and a prostitute by whether or not she covered her hair. And so these ideas were passed on to Christianity and Judaism and into Islam. And so to this day, in that part of the world, a woman who doesn't cover her hair can be accused of being, Ariana in Arabic, which means naked. She might be accused of being unchaste and so on. But so these beliefs that these people have, the foundations of these laws go back thousands and thousands of years to actually pagan goddess worship. So yes, so that's the actual origin of veiling.
And not just the pagan goddess, but the temple priestesses for the prostitution. So
Absolutely, and these women, these married women who used to wear the veil, okay, to signal that they are respectable women, were actually required once a year to go to the temple and perform the rite of hierogamos with men who would come and visit the temple. So ironically, what has become like a symbol of like chastity and modesty and so on, actually had a very, very different meaning in its origin. So all very, very interesting.
and didn't the husbands of these women object to them going once a year to the temple to be having sex with everybody?
Well, not anymore than the wives complaining about their husbands going to the temple. I mean, I can imagine a scene in a home in ancient Assyria and Mesopotamia where the wife is telling her husband, I'm concerned about your faith. You haven't been going to temple lately. Maybe you should go to the temple. But what did men do in the temple? They would go to the temple and they would pick one of these sacred prostitutes and they would make love to her or have sex with her or, whatever you want to call it. To honor the goddess and fertility and so on. And so he was doing it, going to the temple and engaging in these practices. And so, she was doing the same thing.
So it's almost like these French couples, like modern French couples, that, they've been married for 20 years, but they're all having affairs and they all know it, but they're discreet about it. But it's just, hey, we're French and this is what we do.
Yeah, if I could share my screen with you, I'd just like to, there are visual learners out there and they might benefit from this. All right.
I'm not sure. Will it let you present from your side? I'm not sure.
Okay. Can you see this?
Hang on a sec. Let me add it. Okay. And make it a solo. Okay. Okay.
All right. So in this work, I trace every single opinion regarding the veil in the Islamic tradition. And we will go backwards here from the most restrictive to the most permissive. All right. And so according to one tradition that's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, a woman is only properly covered when she is dead and buried. Yes, yeah. She is only properly veiled when she is dead and buried. Fortunately, no jurist ever took that hadith and passed a fatwa based on it. All right? Islam would have ended immediately during its first generation. But that is there. There is another tradition. Okay, there are other traditions attributed to the Prophet and the Imams and so on, that women, for a woman to be properly covered, she should never leave her home. And so there are fatwa, there are edicts, there are rulings from Muslim scholars, and they are followed by some faithful to this day, that a woman should never leave her home, ideally, unless it is absolutely necessary. So this is a position that exists in the tradition, which is basically one in which you're going to incarcerate a woman for life. All right? So this bury them? No, this has not become mainstream, but there are some people who follow this position that women should be confined to their homes. I've met many of them. All right? Another position is that women have to cover everything. They have to cover their feet, they have to cover their hands, and they have to cover their faces, with the exception, some of them, they have to say they have to cover their faces completely. There are others that say they have to cover everything with the exception of one eye. All right, and so this is the position of some Salafi, Wahhabi, Hanbali scholars, and so on. Okay, so you will find this. This does exist. You will find this in Afghanistan. You will find this in Iraq. You will find this in Saudi Arabia. You find this in the Yemen. You find this among the Pashtun and so on in Afghanistan. I'm sure you've seen this in Pakistan. The other position is that they can show their eyes. Okay? So this, I'm sure you've seen this in Pakistan. And then there's another position that they can show their faces and their hands, but they have to cover their feet. So you will see many, many, many Muslim women who dress this way. So that is one ruling. Okay? Another one is that they can show their faces, their hands, and their feet. You will see lots of women who dress this way, sometimes fashionably and so on. This is a position. Another position, okay, is that women can show their forearms. Okay, this might come as a shock to some Muslims. See, the problem is, they will just present those two positions. Okay, and they will ignore to mention all of the other rulings that have been issued and all of the different interpretations of the exegetes of the Quran and so on. So, according to some Muslim scholars, women can show their forearms. According to others, yes, women do not have to cover their hair. They can show their hair. So, there are scholars who hold that view, and they can show their forearms as well. There are also, and listen, when I'm talking about scholars, I'm not talking about, some 20th or 21st century scholars who might be denounced as being deviants and liberals and secularists and closet atheists and heretics and so on. I am talking about classical Islamic jurists and exegetes. All right? And so this is all part of the Islamic tradition. So, according to some Muslim jurists, a woman can show her forearms, so she has to cover up to the elbow and up to the knee. Now, this is getting very interesting because this is basically the Jewish dress code for women. Now, when a Jewish woman gets married, she's expected to cover her hair. Now, among a lot of the Orthodox Jews, what they do is the woman will shave her hair and she will wear a wig. But I know many Jewish women, and this is their dress code. And I know a lot of conservative Christian women as well. This is their dress code. You cover to your elbows, you cover to your knees. All right? The hair, you do not have to cover. So among the Jews, it's the headscarf, and some Orthodox Jewish women do wear the headscarf. The headscarf distinguishes between a married woman and an unmarried woman. But where does that trace back to? That traces back to Babylon and Mesopotamia and everything. These are practices that the Jews brought back after their exile. Now, believe it or not, there are classical Muslim jurists who believe that women have to cover, their bosoms and their private parts and, their torso. So according to some classical Muslim jurists, this is the minimum. Now, we're talking about the minimum that they have to cover. I mean, if a woman wants to cover more, she can. But what is the minimum that she has to cover according to Islamic law? According to some jurists, this is the minimum that they have to cover. And of course, it's based on, place and time and so on. What you wear on the beach or at a pool is not something you're going to wear when you're going to a mosque or in an office, but this is the dress code according to some scholars. All right, so others said, again, so it's just a variation of the same thing, that it's basically you cover to your knees, and some said to the elbow, but some said you just have to cover you have to cover your armpits, you have to cover so on. So according to some, so this is just a visual depiction of that ruling. Now, other classical Muslim scholars believe that women only had to cover their private parts and their breasts. Okay? Yes, that is their position. Others also, believe it or not, said that they just had to cover their private parts, that they did not have to cover their bosoms. And so, according to some classical Muslim scholars, the only thing that women had to cover were their private parts. Okay, now we looked at the Quran, and what does the Quran say? The Quran says, cover your furuj, your private parts, your genitals, right? It says, cover your sawa. It means your genitals, your private parts. So there you have it. So, who issued these edicts? Well, we have Ibn Arabi. Yes, the famous Sufi Muslim jurist, a Muslim mystic, Ibn Arabi was of the belief that the only thing that women had to cover was their private parts.
What about, you mentioned the other
Right.
one, I think it was
Right.
2431, that said like a woman should hide her beauty except from her husband. But that doesn't specifically mention veiling. It just says hide your beauty from everybody but your
Exactly.
husband. So it's an interpretation.
And so, exactly. And so, some scholars, now, if you interpret that verse in light of the other verses, what does beauty mean? Some said, well, it means everything on a woman is beautiful, even, her pinky. Everything has to be covered. But some scholars say, no, this is a metaphor. It stands for their private parts, their intimate parts, the things. So what are the things that they should only show to their husbands? And so scholars like Ibn Arabi, and also on the Shiite side, you have Ibn Junayd al-Iskafi. So Ibn Junayd al-Iskafi was part of a group known as Al-Qadimain, or the two ancient jurists. He is one of the earliest Shiite jurists. Okay, so he's foundational. And he issued in that tradition what is called to this day the most controversial edict or fatwa in Islamic history. He ruled that the only thing that men and women have to cover, in public are their private parts. Okay? And in prayer, their private parts. And so we find these positions, they're not modern positions. They're actually very ancient and very early positions. But if you ask a Muslim scholar to this day, how should a woman dress? They'll just give you those two positions, right? They have to cover, they can show their face and their hands, maybe their feet, and others that they have to cover their faces as well. They just give you those two positions. They don't give you the full spectrum of opinion emitted by scholars over the past 1.5 years. And so, people will say that, this is outrageous. No Muslim woman would ever dress this way. Hello, maybe you should get out of the Quran and get out of the books of Hadith and the books of jurisprudence and actually read some literature. Okay, study some history, and you will find that Muslim women didn't cover up the way they do to this day. Let us take, for example, the case of Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler, traveled the world far and wide, and he described what he encountered. So when he arrived in the Maldives, which are islands in the Indian Ocean off the coast of India, he arrived there and he found out that all of the people on those islands were Muslims. Okay? They had mosques. They were very devout. They would pray 5 times a day. They would recite the Quran. And they were very, very deep in their Islamic faith. But for the life of him, he couldn't get the women to cover up. Because the women would wear sarongs and only sarongs, okay? So just below the belly button to, just above the knee. That is how women dressed in the Maldives. They went around topless. And so he tried to impose his interpretation of Islamic law on those people. He even had a few people executed over it. but he simply could not convince them. For the people on those islands, that wasn't an issue. Breasts weren't private parts. That's how they dressed, how they had always dressed. And so, he just gave up. And so we have, okay, the women in the Maldives walking around topless, and he never ever questioned the sincerity of their faith, that they were believers or disbelievers or sinners or anything like that. All right? He described them as being very good and pious Muslims. When Ibn Battuta traveled throughout Africa to the land of the blacks, as he says, he came across, many different populations. And he found that, again, there were many women who were going around topless. And not only topless, young girls were going around bottomless. And in one passage, he describes celebrating Ramadan and the Taraweeh prayers and the Eid prayers and so on in Black Africa, where there were rows of young women who were completely naked while performing congregational prayers. And others, they were covering, from the navel to the knee or whatever, but they were topless. And again, he said that these people were very devoted to Islam, they were faithful, they prayed, they were trustworthy, they were honest, they were very devoted to reciting and memorizing the Quran. He didn't say that these people were sinners or hypocrites or, that they deserved punishment. I mean, we have, again, so it just goes to show that there was a time where Muslims were far more tolerant than they are today. Yes. And so, again, if you go look at the traditional attire of Muslim women throughout the world over the course of history, you will find a very different picture. In Indonesia, for example, the Indonesians have been Muslims for a very long time. Okay, over 500 years. And if you look at, not only paintings and drawings and so on, but even just historical photographs of how Indonesian women used to dress, you will find once again that just like in Bali, they wore sarongs, which went from the waist to above the knee. For them, showing your thighs was provocative, but showing your breast was not provocative. Yeah, so there you go. There are interpretations and applications of Islam that are far more tolerant than most people would have imagined in their wildest imagination.
Yeah, again, it comes back to the cultural differences as well.
Yes,
certain
absolutely.
Cultures are much more open than others, so it's not
clothing, of course. I mean, why do people dress the way they do? Well, sure, you can say it's religion, it's culture, but primarily and predominantly, it is climate. All right? And so, if some women used to cover their faces, men used to cover their faces. Bedouin men, okay, they have scarves. Sometimes they keep them on their shoulders, but when there's a lot of sun, they cover their heads, and they also veil their faces as well. So this is a question of climate. You have the scorching sun, and the wind could be terrible. It kicks up the sand. It could peel the skin right off of you. And so both men and women used to veil. They used to cover their heads to protect themselves from the sun, and they used to cover their faces as well to protect themselves from the sun and the sand. So again, a function of climate. So again, and the other thing I want to mention too, is swimming attire. Okay. There's a hadith from the Prophet. The whole burkini thing. Okay. Which again, this is a 21st century invention by this Australian lady, and she got it endorsed by some misogynistic cleric who passed a fatwa saying that it was Sharia compliant. There's a hadith that all Muslims should know how to swim. Okay, well, how did Muslim women swim before the invention of the burkini? Did they swim fully dressed? Well, perhaps some did, and I've seen that. Women who will go swim fully dressed. I know of women who will go swim fully dressed, even in the presence of other women. They will be wearing their underwear and their pants and their abaya and their scarf and even their socks. And I know this from women in my family, that they will go in the pool fully dressed like that in basically what is their public street clothing. This is very dangerous. A woman can easily drown. You cannot swim in this type of attire, but some women do swim that way. But how did Muslim women dress in the past? Well, okay, just go before 1979, the Islamic Revolution of Iran. Go look at pictures along the beaches on the Persian Gulf and see how Iranian women used to dress. They used to wear bathing suits. They used to wear bikinis. Go and look at pictures of how women used to dress on the beaches of Lebanon before the rise of Hezbollah and all these Islamist groups. Look at pictures from Morocco from before 1979. In Morocco, the beaches, if you went to the beaches in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, actually, the bikini was legal in Morocco when it was illegal in Spain, because the fascists, the Catholic fundamentalists were in power for a very long time in Spain under Franco. He actually allowed the bikini towards the end of his rule. He legalized it. But before that, under the pressure of ultra-conservative Catholics and so on, it was completely prohibited. But so a Spanish woman couldn't wear a bikini on a beach in Spain, but she can go to Morocco, where she would find that most women were dressed like that. They used to have bikini contests in Casablanca. There was even a fashion show with bikinis in Rabat on the esplanade of the Hassan Athani Mosque. Of all places, no one shrugged their shoulders, no one was upset. You will find that women back then, in the large capitals of the Muslim world, in Tehran, in Baghdad, in Casablanca, all the major cities, the women were very westernized. They didn't wear hijab. They used to show their hair. They used to wear mini skirts. They were all involved in society. They were very active. They were very educated. So a great deal of progress had been made in those societies. But since the rise of political Islam, they haven't been moving forward, they have been moving backwards. People like Khomeini in Iran, and the supporters of Sistani and so on in Iraq, and the influence of the Hezbollah in Lebanon and all these other Islamist groups has brought the Muslim world back centuries. They're trying to bring the Muslim world back to the 7th century. But it's an imaginary 7th century, because as we know, early Islam was not at all the way that these people perceive. And so just going back to this whole thing, how did early Muslim women dress when they went swimming? Well, we have the palaces of the Umayyads and so on. Now, when the Abbasids came, they destroyed everything. They destroyed sculptures. They destroyed art. Okay, they burned books. They wanted to destroy everything. So anything that offended their sentiment, they would paint over. But over the course of the centuries, that paint started to fade, and it started to reveal some magnificent frescoes in these buildings, in these palaces, in these homes, and so on. And so we have actual visual depictions of how Muslim women used to dress in the 7th century, in the 8th century, during the Umayyad period. And what do we find? I can tell you what we don't find. We don't find veiled women. Women were showing their hair. Women were wearing very fashionable clothing. It was fashionable at that time to wear transparent clothing, see-through sheer clothing. We find that women were wearing bikinis to swim, because they used to swim in the ocean. There were also indoor pools or hammams. I mean, these were big pools. They used to wear, the equivalent of bikinis. Some of them used to wear thongs. Some of them used to go topless. Okay, so wait a second. This is how Muslim women used to dress, and they used to go swimming in the 7th century. You have to, step back and say, wait a second, what's this whole burkini thing? What's going on here? How have we come to that point? Because these people say, we have to return to the golden ages of Islam, and we have to follow our pious predecessors and so on. Well, this is how your pious predecessors used to live, and they used to practice their faith. So it's day and night. And so, Islam has become essentially unrecognizable. And this is very, very well known to anyone over the age of 50. Okay, people, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, who knew Islam before the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. This is not the same Islam that was practiced traditionally in the Muslim world in the previous centuries.
Yeah, I heard that a lot from my friends when I worked in Pakistan. That Pakistan was especially Karachi. Karachi was a very cosmopolitan city. It was only in the 70s with political Islam under Zia al-Haq that Islam became politicized, and that Pakistan became sort of this Islamist culture. But prior to that, Karachi was a very open, cosmopolitan city. It was like the stop where jets would stop and refuel, and the air crews would all go out and have a great time. So yeah, I can.
Absolutely.
It's definitely an interesting history.
Yes. Yeah. That part of the world has become increasingly intolerant, since since the rise of political Islam. It's unfortunate. It paints Islam and Muslims in a very poor light, and it's simply not fair, and it's not faithful to the Islamic tradition at all.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, there might have been some ultra-conservative fundamentalists and misogynists and so on, but they may have been a minority, okay, and maybe they repeated their views in their own echo chambers of intolerance, but that was not, that was not the culture as a whole. That didn't reflect reality. They didn't have the power to impose those views on the people. And the thing in Iran is these other Islamists, they impose hijab on non-Muslim women. Okay, that was categorically prohibited in Islamic law. Again, that's another innovation. Actually, under some very, very conservative, some of these radical movements in the past, there was an attempt to distinguish Muslims from Jews and Christians and Samaritans and Zoroastrians, and there was an attempt to impose a dress code, so you could tell visually who's a Samaritan and who's a Zoroastrian. And according to those codes of dress, Jewish women were prohibited from wearing scarves or covering their hair. Christian women were prohibited from wearing scarves. And now you have them, treating everyone like a monolithic mass, trying to impose it on everyone. And traditionally, that wasn't the case, right? That, no, it wasn't imposed on all women. It wasn't imposed on women at all. And we know that. If you study the literature, and you look at the paintings, the sculptures, and everything, the clothing was beautiful. There was variety. It was practical. It was feminine. And all of that disappears with these chadors and these black abayas and the burqas and the niqabs and so on. So, I mean, where does the pluralism go? Where does the diversity go? Where does the beauty go? Right? You're trying to erase women from existence.
And we see them fighting back, as has been happening in Iran over the last year.
And unfortunately, the vast majority of Western feminists and even secularists and so on, they're not on the side of those women. Right? You will find very few feminists who actually stand by women who are fighting against hijab. On the contrary, they're promoting it and defending it and so on. And they've taken the sides of the Islamists on the matter, and they've alienated these Muslim women who are struggling just for basic freedom of choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So it wasn't Richard Dawkins that wrote that letter like 10 years ago that was really controversial, like Dear Muslima, that was like addressed to these Western feminists that like, how come, where's your outrage? Like, why are you not fighting for these oppressed women in Muslim countries, as I
Right.
recall. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And so the only feminists who stand by, Muslim women who are against hijab or who don't want it, imposed upon them, and who recognize the misogynistic and sexist nature of this attire as it's imposed on women, they're secular, universalist feminist. And there are some out there, but generally speaking, they're deplatformed. They're banned from social media. Yes, they're banned from social media. Yeah, so they're men and they're women. You have Naim Bistanji out of France. You have Mimoun Hamido Yahya, who's a Moroccan Berber, who's also a Spanish citizen. She's done some excellent work on that issue. There's many, many others, but they're not well known. And because they are being deplatformed, they're being banned from social media simply for, opposing mandatory hijab, and calling a spade, right? Yeah, I mean, it is, it is, I mean, really. Okay, so I'm going to give you an idea here. Okay. So we addressed the Quran, what it says. There's nothing there. There's just no basis for this dress code there. Nothing there. The Hadith literature, there are a few things here and there. Okay? But we have to put those Hadith about veiling women in their proper context. Okay? So, all right. So I'm going to give you a survey of what the Hadith literature has to say about women. And I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that this reflects the actual teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. All right? But if you go, and I mean now we have like databases of all the Hadith literature. We have many of these volumes in English. And of course, I rely on the Arabic sources themselves. But even the English ones, if you took all the Sunni books of Hadith and you just searched the term women, the same thing with the Shia ones, or you did it in Arabic, this is what you would find. Okay? So, according to the Hadith literature, women are evil. So everything that I'm going to cite here are actually Hadith. Okay. Right. According to Hadith literature, women are evil, women are wicked, women are temptresses, women are seductresses, women are sexually insatiable, women are unfaithful, women are corrupt, women are corrupters, women are crooked by nature, created from a bent rib. If you try to straighten them out, you will break them. Women are worldly. Women who leave their homes without the permission of their husbands are adulteresses. Women who wear perfume in public are adulteresses. Women who adorn themselves in public are adulteresses. Women who do not observe sexual segregation are adulteresses. Women who do not wear hijab are hypocrites who will burn in hell. Women are vaginas. This is actually a famous hadith. It's found in many sources that women are awda, women are private parts, women are genitals. Women consist of 10 private parts. Since women are vaginas, they should be feared and their bodies locked up in their homes. The ambition of women is to find men for sex. Women are sex toys. Women are for rent and for hire. The best women are sexually aroused ones. Women are like sex dolls. Women are playthings. And it continues. The worst of women are those who resist sex like recalcitrant animals. A woman is like a donkey or a black dog. She breaks the prayer of men if she passes in front of them. Even if a woman licks the pus from her husband's sores, she has not fulfilled her dues. An old man is better than a barren woman. Women are inferior to men. Women are defective in intellect and religion. This is a very famous, well-known hadith. There is no piety in women. The evidence of two women equals that of one man. God made women stupid. Menstruation and pregnancy are punishments to prevent them from fornicating and committing adultery constantly. Women should be made to go hungry. Women should be deprived of sufficient clothing to prevent them from leaving their homes. Since God left women backwards, they must be left backwards. And if women knew the rights that their husbands had upon them, they would wipe the dust from their husbands' feet with their faces. And not only that, it continues. Women should not be consulted. Anyone who follows a woman will go astray. Men should not obey women. Husbands should do the opposite of what their wives say. No nation will succeed if they select a woman as their leader. People who entrust themselves to women will never be saved. It is a disgrace to obey women. Men who obey women will be ruined. Prosperity lies in opposing women. Whoever obeys his wife, God will cast him into hell face first. Were it not for women, God would have been truly worshipped. Were it not for Eve, no woman would have cheated on her husband. Women are like sheep. Women are bad omens. Women are devils. Women are the snares of Satan. Women are the soldiers of Iblis. 99% of women are destined to hellfire. And were it not for women, all men would go to paradise. And it continues. Women are the slaves of their spouses. Husbands should hang their whips where their wives can see them. Women can be beaten by their husbands for just causes. If a woman refuses to have sexual intercourse with her husband, he can lock her in a room, tie her to a bed, beat her, and take her by force. Women who do not satisfy their husbands sexually will burn in hell. Women should prostrate themselves before their husbands. Women are only properly covered when they are dead and buried, and the majority of the inhabitants of hell are women. So, okay. Now,
Sounds like the men who wrote this had some serious psychological issues about women. I think incel would be the term.
Absolutely. And now, when people like myself cite these sayings, we are accused of being Islamophobic. And we're banned. No matter how many times we insist that we do not believe that these are authentic traditions. We do not believe that the Prophet Muhammad actually said these things. It is our belief that these are lies by misogynistic men who had serious psychological issues. All right? And so, we're not criticizing God, we're not criticizing the Quran or Muhammad or Islam, all right? So, these are the sayings of men, right? These are the interpretations of men. So whether you want to believe any of this stuff is from God or not or whatever, that we have to set that aside, okay? We can't dispute that religions are created by human beings. They're interpreted by human beings. Okay, who's going to dispute that? And that there are many different interpretations, right? There isn't just like radical Islamic fundamentalism. No. There are many different schools of thought, law, theology, and so on in Islam. Same thing in Christianity. There isn't just one. There isn't just the clan, or the Aryan nation, or Christian fundamentalist or Southern. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different denominations with different interpretations. Judaism. You have the ultra-Orthodox, you have the Orthodox, you have the conservative, you have Reform. They are radically different, okay? And you will find that the moderate followers of these traditions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and other faith traditions, the moderates, okay, they have a great deal in common. All right? They are closer to each other than they are to the extremists in their own traditions. So a moderate Muslim is much closer to a moderate Jew or a moderate Christian than to any of these extremists. All right? So I'm not bashing any particular religion. None of this is Islamophobic, but you have to understand the philosophical foundation, the cultural foundation to these rulings, right? These laws didn't appear in a vacuum, all right? And that's the problem with some Muslims. They think that the Sharia is God's law. No. A book appeared, the Quran, okay? That's it. That's the only thing that was circulating. All right? Hundreds of years after, millions upon millions of traditions of the Prophet were in circulation. Impossible that any man could have said all of these things. Absolutely impossible. So, even Muslim scholars recognize that 99.9% of these sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad were forgeries. An attempt was made to go through this material to sieve, truth from falsehood. And that's what some of the Shia did and some of the Sunnis did, and they ended up with these so-called sahih or authentic or canonical compilations of tradition. All right? When we examine those traditions critically, we find that they are not genuine, they are not reliable, they are not trustworthy, that they have been manipulated, that they have been changed. So the Sunni traditionists, the Hadith scholars, the Shias as well, they all admitted that most of the Hadith were fake. They tried to select some that were authentic. But the problem is that they closed the canon. They stopped the process of critical thinking and analysis, right? And they basically treat like Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim as if, it's the word of God, right? It's like your second scripture. This is a problem, okay? And so, again, it's not, Islamic law. Islamic law didn't exist at the time of the Prophet. I'm sorry. There's only a few laws in the Quran. And this has been studied by jurists, by scholars, by academics. We have found that 99% of the laws in Sharia law or Islamic law do not come from the Quran. They don't even come from the Hadith. That they come from pre-Islamic legal customs and practices. They come, to a great degree, from Byzantine law. And so, again, they come out of the deserts. The Byzantine Empire collapses. They didn't change anything, okay? The only thing that changed was who was in power. You went from Heraclius and, all these other people and everything to Arab commanders and so on and caliphs and everything. They kept the administration intact, right? Even the language of the administration continued to be Greek, not Arabic. It was only, much later that they decided to make Arabic the official language. So all of the laws, everything stayed the same. It was a change of leadership, okay? It was a new president. And so those laws continued to be applied. If there was something that was clearly incompatible with Islam in the Quran, they rejected it, but they embraced those laws. When they went into Persia, they embraced many of those laws. When they went into North Africa and Andalusia, there were existing law codes. They integrated them. So Islamic law is not, is not Islamic in that sense that it comes just from the Quran and the Hadith or anything. Absolutely not. To question these laws and these rulings is not to question God if you believe in God, or the Quran if you believe in the Quran, or Muhammad or anything like that. It's a historical process. So, you know, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And
So,
we see the same thing. We see the same thing in Judaism and Christianity, where the Bible has been altered, right? You have books of the Old Testament, like Isaiah, like Malachi, that are written in the book of Isaiah or Malachi, but they're hundreds of years later, like the last half of Isaiah, the last half of Malachi. You have the same thing with Paul. Like Paul in Corinthians is talking about praising women,
right.
foremost among the apostles. And then you have these letters in Titus, that are written in Paul's name that are saying that women should be silent. So you see the same sort of thing in
No, no,
Judaism and Christianity.
absolutely, absolutely. And this is an important point that you're making that needs to be emphasized. In the Torah, women are and men are told to cover their aruvim. It's related to the Arabic word aura, which just means genitals. So, if you follow the Torah and the Torah alone, you're just supposed to. It's just basic common decency, right? You have to cover your private parts. It is only in the in the Talmud, which again comes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, maybe even thousands of years later, that we find these rulings. And if you study the rulings, they become increasingly restrictive in terms of women, right? To the point that it was a sin to even see, a finger of a woman, and that seeing the pinky of a woman was the equivalent of seeing her genitals. So the same thing that happened in Islam is the same thing that happened in Judaism. It's the same thing that happened in Christianity. We know it's a historical fact that women were active leaders in the early Christian movement. And it was only after a council that took place a few hundred years after Jesus that women were banned from ecclesiastic roles. And they were sidelined. So we know that during the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there were women who were priests and who were bishops and so on. And now all of a sudden, you women, back to your homes, right? Kind of like, to the back pew, back of the bus kind of idea. It was like a misogynistic takeover.
Yeah, yeah,
So this
for sure.
applies to all religions. Okay, I'm not just criticizing Islam. I'm saying that all world religions, well, not all, but most of them, have treated women very, very poorly, and that's an understatement. Now, there are some traditions there where women are held in high esteem. We find that among some certain Native American religions. Now, there are many different Native American religions, but by and large, if you look at the traditions of the Eastern Woodland Indians and the Lakota and the Anishinaabe, women are viewed as sacred. All right? Right? They are wakan. They are sacred. And so women, you will find their status and their treatment in those cultures, in those faith traditions, to be much better than what you find in this monotheistic Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. You have the Cagaba or Kogi Indians from the Sierra Nevada in Colombia. They're monotheistic. They believe in Aluna, the goddess, right? So they believe in one goddess. And so, correspondingly, you have a much better treatment of women, and they're much more respected. So there are traditions out there where women have a higher status, but unfortunately, in many of the world religions, women have been treated terribly, absolutely terribly. And again, all done in the name of God, all done in the name of God, right? And, his representatives, who are these men who hate women.
Yeah, sadly,
Sadly,
we
sadly,
see
but
this.
again, not all men hate women. And in
Yeah.
all of
And
these,
it's
right, right,
and
and
it's not all men enforcing the hijab. Like you see a lot of women saying, I choose to do this because it's my way of honoring God. And yes, it's their culture, their society that has brainwashed them to think that
but
way,
yes,
but
yes,
it's their choice.
yeah, of course. But the thing is, who told them so?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
as Na'im Bistanji said, that if it were not for men mandating it, no woman would ever have worn hijab. Okay? So, who's telling you that God tells you this? And if you read this book, Hijab, Word of God or Word of Man, it will become clear to any open minded, objective reader that it is not the Word of God. It is clearly the Word of man. All right? So it's men who are telling you that you have to cover up. But also, in this work, I highlight the opinions and the scholarship of Muslim women and Muslim men who actually are against hijab. All right? And these are not, again, so these are believing Muslims, practicing Muslims, highly educated, qualified people, including jurists, including ulama, all right? So these are perfectly qualified people. They are authorities in their fields, and they do not support, they're opposed to hijab. All right, so that is also part of the Islamic tradition. And like I showed you when I showed you all of those drawings, um, all of those positions are there. All right, all of those positions are there. So all of those women are, all of those women, any woman who would dress that way is abiding by Islamic law in its broadest sense, right? They're not outside of the tradition. Okay? So, again, it's one thing for a woman to say, you know, I'm convinced by these arguments, I'm going to cover my hair, I'm going to dress modestly. That's fine. There's no issue with that. The problem is when you try to impose that or you try to coerce that. And well, they'll tell you it's a free choice. It's not a free choice if you're told that if you show your hair, you're going to burn in hell for eternity. Okay? Or if I show my ankle is going to burn in hell for 40,000 years. It's the gun to your head, give me your purse. Is it a free choice? No, it isn't. Okay? Right? I respect the tradition. No, it's just out of fear. It's out of terror. As you mentioned, it is a form of brainwashing. It is absolutely a form of spiritual abuse. Yeah. So, and of course, there are women who do so, and sometimes they go against their parents. Sometimes their parents are against it, right? So it's not just parents enforcing it, but again, so if you're not listening to your dad, you're listening to some other bearded guy with a turban who's telling you that you have to do it, and he's terrified you into doing it because you're going to burn in hell. Again, it's one thing if a woman wants to cover up. But it's another if you think that women who don't cover up are harlots and trollops and so on, who will burn in hell and be tortured and so on, that they're not faithful, that they're hypocrites, or that they're disbelievers. Okay, and so this is the common rhetoric used by the proponents of the hijab, that a woman who doesn't wear hijab is basically a whore. Listen, if you want me to respect your choice to dress that way, maybe you should extend the courtesy to me as well if I choose not to dress that way and not say that I'm an infidel and a hypocrite and an apostate. Again, women are intimidated, they're threatened. Some have been assaulted, some have been raped for not wearing hijab. That's the
Some have
issue
been
there.
killed.
So, of course, they've been killed. So, people talk about the right to wear hijab. Well, who's disputing that? The real question is the right not to wear hijab. All right? That's the real issue there. The right not to wear hijab. Right? That's the issue. That's what we take issue with.
Yeah.
Coercion
well,
and compulsion.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've been chatting for about 90 minutes, so we should probably wrap it up. Any parting thoughts you would like to convey to our viewers?
Well, maintain an open mind. I would encourage you to read this book if you would like to understand more about the history of hijab from an Islamic point of view, but also in light of the history of costume and attire and clothing. And if you want to look at the origins of these ideas and where they come from, because all religions borrow from previous religions and so on. There's a lot of intertextuality, all kinds of influences are going on, all kinds of forces, cultural forces that shape any religious tradition. So that is definitely a starting point. I know it's an academic book, so it could be a little bit costly. That's the nature of academic publishing. If you can't purchase a book, perhaps you can get a copy from your local library, your university library. If they don't have a copy, you can talk to a librarian. And submit an acquisition request. Most public libraries, if you submit a request, say, I'm interested in this book, can you add it to the collection? By and large, they will comply because they're there to serve their patrons. So start there and just start with an open mind and recognize that there is a broad spectrum of opinion on this subject.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll put a link in the description if you want to find Dr. Morrow's book. You can find it there in the description. Please check it out and read it and let us know, especially if you are a Muslim who might be struggling with her faith and some of these hijab regulations. By all means, please read it and educate yourself. Everybody at AAI who has come out of a belief tradition understands the struggle, the fighting against what you've been taught all your life. So there are people out there who get what you're going through, and these kind of resources are helpful, that they help you to contextualize the history of your faith. So by all means, please check it out if it's something that you think will help you in your own journey. So great. Well, thank you. I appreciate you coming on, John. It was an interesting discussion.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
I didn't think we were going to talk for 90 minutes, but I mean, we certainly covered a lot of territory, so it was definitely interesting. So great. Well, thanks you for
again.
coming on. Great. So I'd like to remind everybody, please hit that like and subscribe button, and we will talk to everybody at the next podcast. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.